Decades later, this surveillance image still haunts everyone who knows about this case. To those who are new to this case, it seems harmless in the image, two little boys leading a toddler, holding his hands while they are shopping in the shopping mall in Bootle, England, in February 1993. The older boys, John Venables and Robert Thompson, seem like they could be his brother. The little boy is known as James Bulger, but they weren't. Instead, they were the toddler's abductors and soon to be his killers. Within hours of that surveillance image being captured that same afternoon, 10-year-olds John and Robert had tortured James to death, and in the time between that image being captured and when James was killed in a railway embankment a few miles away, the three boys had been seen walking around the Merseyside area by dozens of people. Later, these witnesses would admit that James looked distressed, yet they did nothing to intervene. Some even saw the older boys punch and kick James, but still most of them did nothing, and those that did stop them to question, soon enough decided to let them go. John and Robert first planned to snatch James away from his mother in the midst of a busy shopping mall. The boys ended up at the New Strand shopping centre in Bootle near Liverpool on that afternoon after they had skipped school. At the mall, they wandered from shop to shop, stealing anything they could get their hands on, then tossing their stolen goods down escalators just because it was fun for them. At some point, for unclear reasons, John and Robert decided to steal someone's child. It is still unknown who decided to plan this, but after their eventual arrests, they did decide to blame each other. James was not the first child that they had tried to abduct. In fact, that potential first child almost became their first victim. Inside a TJ Hughes department store, a woman noticed that two boys were trying to get her kid's attention. Moments later, her 3-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son was missing. The mother quickly found her daughter, however there were no signs of her son. She asked her daughter, who ominously said, "Gone outside with the boy." The woman began calling her son and ran outside, where she found John and Robert beckoning the boy to follow them. John saw the mother and they told the boy to go back and they disappeared. Simple luck had saved that boy, but James's fate was sealed. Soon after they aborted their first abduction and last abduction, they started to loiter around a snack kiosk, hoping they were able to steal some candy when they fatally noticed James by the door of a nearby butcher shop. James Bulger's mother, Denise, had momentarily become distracted. At this moment, the boy took a chance, and they got the toddler to come with them. John held his hand as he led him away. Several shoppers recalled they witnessed them walking. Sometimes James ran ahead, leaving John and Robert to call out to him, saying, "Come on, baby." At 3:42 p.m., they were caught on camera leaving the mall. By this time, Denise was panicking. She had thought her son was right by her side as she was placing her order at the butcher shop, but when she looked down, he was gone. She quickly found more security and described her son and what he was wearing. At first, they announced the boy's name over the mall loudspeakers, but by 4:15 p.m., there was still no sign of James, and he was then reported missing to the local police station. After John and Robert left with James, the toddler began to cry out for his mother. The older boys ignored him and continued down to a secluded area near a canal. At the canal, they dropped James on his head and left him on the ground as he cried out. A woman passing by noticed James but did nothing to help the little boy. John and Robert called for James to come and he still followed them, but this was most likely out of fear. By now, James's forehead was bruised and cut, causing John and Robert to pull the hood of the toddler's anorak over his head to try and keep the injury from being noticed. On top of this, people who walked by them could still see a slight glimpse of the forehead injury. Even one person saw James crying, but still no one would do anything to help him. The older boys then meandered around shops, buildings and parking lots. They walked down to one of the busiest streets in Liverpool. Some witnesses later said they saw James resisting and screaming for his mother. One person came out to say that they saw James being kicked by Robert in the ribs for his resisting. Still not one person helped him. Soon after, a woman saw Robert punch and shake him, but she decided to close the curtains and pretend that she didn't see a thing. However, one bystander provided a glimmer of hope. With evening approaching, an elderly woman saw James crying, noticed his injuries, and asked the three boys what had happened. But John and Robert said, "We just found him at the bottom of the hill." She was satisfied with their explanation, and she told them to take James down to the nearby Walton Lane police station. She called out to them, but they walked away and did not look back. She was extremely concerned, but another woman told her that she had heard James laughing moments ago, so both women assumed everything was okay. Later that night, one of the women saw the news that James Bulger was missing. She phoned the police and expressed her regrets for not doing anything sooner. Not long after the elderly woman sent the boys on their way, James was almost rescued again. A woman concerned for the toddler told John and Robert that she would take the child to the police herself, but when she was asked by another woman nearby to look after her daughter while she did so, she refused because her dog didn't like children. Another opportunity to save James went missed. John, Robert and James then walked into two different stores where they interacted with both shopkeepers who were suspicious of them but eventually let them go. Then John and Robert came upon two older boys that they already knew. These boys had asked them who the toddler was, and John replied that he was Robert's brother and they were taking him home. They arrived at the railway station and they were hesitant about what they were going to do next, and perhaps they were reconsidering everything that they had done so far. But then John and Robert turned back towards the privacy of the deserted railway. The brutal torture and murder of James Bulger occurred sometime between 5:45 and 6:30 p.m. John and Robert had bought blue paint that they stole from the shopping mall and splashed it into James's left eye. They then kicked him, pummeled him with bricks and stones, and stuffed batteries into his mouth. The boys then hit James on the head with a 22-pound iron bar, which resulted in 10 skull fractures. Altogether, James had sustained 42 injuries to his face, head, and body. He was so badly beaten, authorities would later conclude that there was no way in which to tell which injury was the fatal one. Eventually, John and Robert placed James's body across the train tracks, in hopes of making the whole thing look like an accident, and then they ran away before the train came along. Forensic pathologists would later conclude that when James was placed on the tracks, he had already passed by this point. The next day, police searched the canal where the boys had been earlier in the afternoon, due to a witness coming forward, and reported that they saw the three boys there. Other searches were conducted as well, but they led nowhere. There was barely anything to go on. James's parents were suspects at one point, but the police looked through CCTV footage and they saw two small boys lead James away. Once those images were released, the media went crazy and the search for James intensified. When James' Bulger father, Ralph, saw that it was just two boys with whom James had left with, he was relieved. He said, "I looked at Denise and smiled with relief. He's going to be all right, Denise. He's with two young kids. He's going to be all right." The search ended 2 days after the disappearance, when 4 children discovered James's body on the rail track, just 200 yards from the nearest police station. All of the items that the boys had used in the torture were found strewn about the area, the iron bar, stones and bricks all covered in James's blood. The stolen blue paint tin was found nearby as well. With some evidence in hand and the knowledge that James was with 2 children, the police checked with nearby schools for their absentee list, comparing with the day of the disappearance. This caused various children to be identified as potential killers, with some parents even reporting their own kids. But it was ultimately an anonymous phone call to the police that implicated John and Robert as the killers. The caller told the police that the boys were both absent from school on Friday, and that they had seen blue paint on the sleeve of John's jacket. The police visited the homes of both boys and discovered blood on Robert's shoes and blue paint on John's jacket as said. Despite the evidence, John and Robert weren't the prime suspects. Police were focused on other children who had already had a violent record, and they remained convinced that the boys from the CCTV footage looked 13 or 14, not 10. During their separate police interviews, John and Robert turned on each other. Over the course of the interview, which lasted several days, John eventually confessed. He said, "I did kill him. What about his mum? Will you tell her I'm sorry?" Robert, however, completely denied everything. Detective Sergeant Phil Roberts said he totally denied everything, but in the end he shot himself in the foot by giving me a detailed account of what James was wearing. He was pretty chill throughout the entire interview. He earned the nickname "the boy who did not cry" from the press. John and Robert were both eventually charged, and 9 months later their trial began. People gathered outside the courthouse and yelled, "Killed the bastards," or "A life for a life." This level of disgust increased when the public saw Robert's cold demeanour and remorseless behaviour at trial, whereas John was having constant outbursts. Even though psychiatrists and authorities have never been able to reach a conclusion to their motives, it was assumed that Robert was the instigator to the whole crime. Court-appointed psychiatrists determined that the two boys knew right from wrong and weren't sociopaths, but were unable to uncover any concrete motives for the murder. Motive aside, both John and Robert were convicted, making them the youngest to be convicted of the crime in Britain in 250 years. John and Robert were then sentenced to serve Her Majesty's pleasure as protocol for juvenile offenders who are convicted of murder or manslaughter. This indefinite sentence has no maximum, but does have a minimum to be determined on a case-by-case basis. In this case, it was 8 years, at which the time the boys would be 18. After this point, both boys were to be assessed, and if they weren't deemed to be a danger to society, they would then be released. During their prison time, neither boy showed violent or aberrant behaviour, but instead served their time quietly. When the time came in 2001, both the boys were released. Upon their release, both were granted new identities and granted legal anonymity due to the public fury that surrounded their trial and in case people tried to hunt them down. No attempts have been made to date, but James's mother Denise was able to find Robert in 2004, but was paralysed with hatred and could not confront him. Currently, Robert is believed to be living a quiet life, but the same can't be said for John. In 2010, he was imprisoned for downloading images depicting various kinds of sexual abuse being inflicted upon male toddlers. He became eligible for parole in 2013, at which time Ralph Bulger told the parole board that he couldn't forgive his son's killers and that John should not be released. He said, "Sometimes you feel like you're having a heart attack. It's just a big knot in your chest, and that's been there since day one." However, John was released. In November 2017, John was again imprisoned when more child abuse images and a paedophile manual that provided instructions on committing heinous acts with children were discovered on his computer. John was sentenced to 3 years and 4 months in prison, not far from half the amount of the time he served for joining Robert in perpetrating the murder of James a quarter century before. John made headlines again in September 2023 when he was granted a parole hearing to take place in November. James's parents immediately spoke out, saying once more that John should spend the rest of his life in prison for the shocking crime he committed that tragic day in 1993.